Thank you. This panel places the Palestinian right of return in its international context by describing and analyzing the current positions of some of the key players influencing the issue. The powerful influences that the Israeli and American states and the European Union exert on any discussion of the Palestinian right of return is perhaps most striking when compared to the weakness of the PLO position, which Dr. Said elaborated on this morning, and the complete silencing of the refugees themselves. The panelists who are discussing these issues are, to use an Arabic expression, أشهر من أن يعرف, which means more famous than to be presented. I will hence limit the presentations to 2 words, knowing that the full bios are included in your conference packets. Our first speaker is Dr. Ilan Pappe, who will be presenting the Israeli position. Dr. Pappe is the director of the International Relations Division of Haifa University and the academic director of the Institute of Peace Research at Givat Havera in Israel. Our second speaker is Dr. Noam Chomsky. He's a professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. So he has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and U.S. foreign policy. Our third speaker is Ilan Pappe. He's the editor-in-chief of Le Monde Diplomatique and has a specialization in Middle East affairs. He's also the author of numerous books. Our fourth speaker is Mr. Jaber Saiman. He's an independent Palestinian researcher working in Lebanon and author of an article on the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And finally, we have Robert Fisk, who's still sitting with the audience and will join us. He's the correspondent. He's the correspondent of the UK Independent, reporting from Beirut on Middle East and Balkan affairs. So Mr. Fisk will be speaking on the Arab government positions on Palestinians' refugee rights of return. Mr. Saiman will be speaking on the PLO from rights to return to Bantustan. Dr. Gresh will be speaking about the European Union's position, Dr. Chomsky about the US, and we'll start with Dr. Pappe with Israel's role on the issue.
Thank you for the introduction. I am very happy to be here and hopefully contribute to a new awareness of the refugee problem and to change the course of the peace process into a better and more constructive ways. The attitude of Israel to the refugee problem has to be analyzed against the Jewish behavior in Palestine during the 1948 war. The Labor Zionist movement wished to bridge the impossible gap between the ethnocentric nationalist ideology on the one hand and the wish to belong to the community of liberal and democratic Western states on the other. An impossibility that could only be achieved, so it had been presumed at the time, by cleansing the territory of the Jewish state from any substantial Palestinian presence. In the months leading to the war, Israel prepared its ethnic cleansing program, a plan that included mass expulsions, sporadic massacres, campaign of terror and intimidation, and finally confiscation of land and assets. When the war of 1948 ended, every possible step had been taken to prevent the repatriation of the refugees to Israel. The act of people returning to their homes after the winds of war subsided was regarded an elementary and basic humanitarian development by the international community, which through the United Nations General Assembly authorized it in Resolution 194. The international support for the unconditional repatriation of the Palestinian refugees in 1948 was even backed by the United States delegation to the United Nations. The Israeli government implemented a vigorous and callous policy of eradicating all that was left of the deserted Palestinian villages and neighborhoods establishing in their place new Jewish settlements or turning them into cultivated land. This policy began in August 1948 and ended only in 1954. By that time, any demand for repatriation necessitated uprooting of Jewish settlers brought by the government to the new settlements or into the old Palestinian houses. During that time, some Israeli politicians and intellectuals put forward the idea of repatriation of about 100,000 refugees out of the million, some like Moshe Sharet doing it in response to American pressure, a pressure which did not last for long, others like the philosopher Martin Buber doing it out of a moral position. But the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion rejected all these offers and led the anti-repatriation policy in full force. Ever since 1954 and until recently, the refugees were excluded from the Israeli collective memory and were replaced in the consciousness of Israelis as well as in the Hebrew vocabulary with derogative terms such as terrorists and saboteurs. There was no refugee problem on the agenda as far as the various Israeli governments were concerned. There was Palestinian terror which had to be dealt with by military means. In the end of the June 1967 war, Israel created a new refugee problem. However, those expelled from the West Bank were acknowledged as refugees by the Israeli government and public, since the public and the political system were divided on the issue of the occupied territories. Since a large number of Israeli Jews were willing to withdraw from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the return of refugees of 1967 war to these territories seemed legitimate and did not involve any soul-searching on the part of the Israelis. The Palestine question for Israel and the world at large was the fate of the Palestinian territories occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. Israel quite successfully conducted a campaign of repressing the refugee problem out of the peace agenda. Ever since the first peace conference on the post-1948 Palestine reality, the Lausanne Conference of April 1949, the refugee problem was excluded from the peace talks and dissociated from the concept of the Palestine conflict. In the wake of the June 1967 war, the world at large accepted the Israeli claim that the conflict in Palestine evolves around the territories occupied by Israel in that war. Several Arab regimes cooperated with this notion when they were ready to abandon the refugee problem as an issue in their bilateral peace negotiations with Israel. The issue of the refugees was kept alive and in the consciousness of the people in the Middle East and in the world at large by the PLO activity and policies. Outside the Middle East, it was only the United Nations organization that mentioned in several of its resolutions the obligation of the international community to ensure the full and unconditional repatriation of the Palestinian refugees, a commitment made first in Resolution 194 from the 11th of December 1948. The Oslo Accord is not different. Its architects, American, Israelis and Palestinians, have placed the refugee issue in a subclause made almost invisible in the flood of words in the documents describing future bridges, bypasses, garrisons and cantons. The Palestinian partners to the accord contributed to this obfuscation, probably out of negligence, not bad intention, but the result is very clear and the same. The refugee problem, the heart of the Palestine conflict, a reality acknowledged by all the Palestinians wherever they are and by anyone sympathizing with the Palestinian cause, was marginalized in the Oslo documents. The structure built for implementing the accord accentuated the negotiators' disregard of and almost scornful attitude to the refugee problem. A multilateral committee meant to deal with the refugee problem was directed by the Israelis to deal only with the 1967 West Bank refugees, but not with the 1948 ones. The Oslo process, the implementation of the document, was no better. In fact, it was worse. The rules of the Oslo game defined support by the Palestinian leadership for the right of return as a violation of the game, similar to the building of a new Jewish settlement in the occupied territories. Not that new settlements were not built in violation of the accord, but this is beside the point. 5 years after the bifurcation and cantonization of the Palestinian entity and its transformation into a Bantustan, the Palestinian leadership was given the permission to express its wish to deal with the refugee problem as part of the negotiations over the permanent settlement of the Palestine question. The Israeli discourse at this point distinguishes between the introduction of the refugee problem as a negotiable issue on the agenda, a legitimate Palestinian move now, and the demand for the right of return, which is described as a Palestinian provocation and as a violation of the rule. The victory of Ehud Barak in the last Israeli general election was hailed locally and internationally as the return of the Jewish state to the peace track. A sigh of relief accompanied the defeat of Benjamin Netanyahu, and an optimistic air surrounded the resumption of peace negotiations with the Palestinians. As the international media was quick to note, the final stage in the long road begun in Oslo is near at hand. And yet, so far, we have witnessed the conclusion of another interim agreement, an improved version of the VAI Accord, the Sharm el-Sheikh Agreement, and preliminary negotiations on how to negotiate the final stages. In short, very little progress compared with the negotiations under the Netanyahu regime, announced in a highly dramatic manner and interpreted by whomever sponsors the Oslo Accord with the help of extremely sanguine discourse of peace. The balance of power between the present Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority ensured the exclusion so far of the refugee issue from the bilateral negotiations. Ever since the election of the new Barak government in Israel, the negotiations over a permanent settlement are heralded and announced, while at the same time no real discussions are taking place. Should these discussions finally begin, the agenda is already very clear. In January 2000, the Barak government presented a paper endorsed by the American negotiators, which defines the parameters of the negotiations. This is an Israeli dictate. There is no counter-Palestinian proposal. None had been prepared, none is being expected to be prepared. The negotiations will be an Israeli and American pressure on the Palestinians to accept the Israeli paper. This paper includes, among other things, an absolute and categorical rejection of the Palestinian right of return. It leaves open for discussion the number of Palestinian refugees that would be allowed to return to the territories controlled by the Palestinian Authority, that is, 1967 refugees, territories that would comprise 60% of the Gaza Strip and 55% of the West Bank. Thus, if the Israelis and the American negotiators have their way, the right of return, as it was legitimized and defined by Resolution 194 from 11 of December 1948, is excluded from the terms of the final agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the State of Israel, an agreement which is meant to end the conflict and on which a permanent peace would be declared as being intact and valid, probably on the lawn of the White House. How would the Palestinian Authority react to such a dictate? Until now, and this report is written in the beginning of April 2000, it does not have as yet to respond. There is a stalemate as the two sides fail to agree on the agenda and the timetable. The progress on the Israeli-Syrian front has also decelerated the negotiations, but they may be resumed in any given moment given the deceleration on the Israeli-Syrian front. A Palestinian insistence on bringing to the table the right of return as a topic for negotiations has already been preempted by Ehud Barak, who declared that in this case the two sides would have to be content with the signing of yet another interim agreement and leave it at that, while this should not preclude another ceremony on the White House lawn declaring the end of the Palestine conflict. The two sides would have to wait for better times before they resume the attempt to conclude a permanent settlement. Should the Palestinian Authority give in to the Israeli demand, it would deny the most formative and basic element of the Palestinian existence, equal to a Palestinian readiness to abandon the claim to Palestine itself. A considerably domestic coercion against any opposition inside the authorities' territories on the one hand, and an absolute cessation of the authorities' ties with the rest of the Palestinian people on the other would be the price the authority would have to pay in order to keep its leadership at least in the territories. For many Palestinians, the discourse of peace employed ever since the beginning of Oslo would produce a reality of oppression and indirect occupation, as well as a perpetuation of the refugee problem. The arsenal of violence and armed struggle on the Palestinian side has not as yet been exhausted, and in due course another uprising or guerrilla warfare could be expected, motivated by the sheer force of frustration and dismay, more powerful than ever before in Palestine's history. The peace process would produce finally another bloodshed. In order to prevent this, several campaigns should be enacted from now on. The first is within the Palestinian communities themselves, including those in Israel, in the territories and the diaspora, for presenting a united front on the issue of the refugees. The second, in the world at large, and in particular in America, for the sake of explaining and depicting the possible scenarios that can develop from the post-Oslo reality. The major aim here is to remove the halo of peace hovering over the Barak government. Inquiry Commission would easily find out that the present government is acting as brutally in the territories still under its control as the Netanyahu government did. It builds settlements, expands beyond any precedent the Jewish takeover of Greater Jerusalem, abuses Palestinians and checkpoints, transferring them from East Jerusalem and cantonizing their country. The second aim is to stress the strong and undeniable connection between the continued disregard for the refugee problem and the inevitable collapse of the peace process. The third should be waged in Israel itself. It is no incident that the leading member of the Labour Party advocated, notwithstanding a strong rebuke from his Prime Minister, the return of at least 100,000 refugees to Israel proper. The number at this stage is not important. The principle is. In the center and left of center of the Jewish state, there is a recognition, not widespread admittedly, but growing, of the need to consider seriously the right of return, if not on an ethical basis, at least on a functional one. In the case of the United States, due to its paramount and decisive role in the peace process, one should try another and additional approach. The American negotiators' tendency, which does not change from one administration to the other, is to adopt a quantitative approach to the conflict solution. Anything which is measurable is visible and therefore divisible. It is high time that American negotiators will acquaint themselves with more invisible aspects of the conflict which are indivisible. The Israeli guilt and responsibility are also an important, indeed a decisive factor in the process of reconciliation and peacemaking. Israel as a victimizer should be forced to face its past through direct contact with the victims. It should seek together with the victims, not vengeance, but what in South Africa was rightly called restorative justice. This means the payment of compensation for the victims, rectification of past evils through the right of return, and a territorial solution that would enable both Jews and Palestinians to live in peace under a political structure and within a geographical space representing their aspirations and hopes. In other words, the merchandise peace negotiators should sell is not just territories for peace. Far more important, or at least equally important, is restitution and retribution. In various parts of the world, such mediation between victimizers and victims are taking place. There are places where even survivors of genocides have to live and learn to exist with the descendants of the genociders. It is possible, if it is possible there, in such awful cases, it should be possible here. But for that to happen in Israel and in America, in America, one should restore the mirror to the faces of the Israelis and force them to confront what they had done in 1948 and realize the implication of that deed for the chances of peace in the Middle East. Those who are committed to the cause of Palestine, to the cause in Palestine, Israel, and in the world at large, should move from slogans to concrete planning. A scheme should be devised on the basis of the work of Salman Abu Sitta and others, which explains how the right of return can be implemented. There were plans in the past, even by Jews such as Martin Buber in 1958, who advised abortively the government of his days to compensate the refugees and accept at least a symbolic number of refugees back to the country, which can inspire a bold and more just solutions to the problem. The scheme should take into account the new realities on the ground, as well as the needs and predicaments of the various refugee camps and their particular conditions. There is also a need to connect the solution for the refugee problem to the question of the future political structure in Israel and in Palestine. It seems that the post-Oslo reality created a strong Jewish state and a weak Palestinian protectorate. The large number of Jewish settlers in and around the protectorate, the million Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the basic economic and military balance of power may defeat the idea of a two-state solution. There is a better chance of solving the right of return in a more loose political structure between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, one which relates to Jewish nationalism as well as to Palestinian nationalism, but more importantly helps to rectify the horrendous crime committed against the Palestinian people in 1948 without causing more sorrow and suffering. This is not an easy task, but one without which the conflict in Palestine would be far from being solved and settled. Thank you.
I trust you will be a stern disciplinarian, since I'm counting on you. In the few minutes that allotted to me, I'll concentrate on U.S. policy, and I'd like to focus on one particular event, namely the signing of the Declaration of Principles and surrounding events in September 1993. In Washington, and the way the processes have played themselves out since that time in a quite predictable fashion, and a few words on how the situation evolved to that stage. So, time to mention only a few highlights. In the early September 1993, that period, in the Declaration of Principles itself, in the Washington meetings, the refugees one issue was the Palestinian refugees. That issue didn't arise, but it did arise a few months later at the first meeting of the General Assembly that took place after the Oslo Accord signing in Washington. That's December 1993, and at that General Assembly meeting, the United States essentially settled the issue of the refugees from its point of view, and as Ilan Pappe pointed out, the U.S. point of view is decisive. It has overwhelming force, and though it doesn't determine everything, it has a huge impact on what happens, and in that region, a near decisive impact. The Clinton administration at the UN rescinded Resolution 194, in effect. It voted against it for the first time. The preceding support for it had always been hypocritical, so in a way this was a welcome move. It resolved an element of hypocrisy, but the U.S. voted against 194 for the first time. 2 votes against it in that session, Israel and the United States. The U.S. also, I should mention on the side, just as background, that since the 1960s, since decolonization began to have an effect on the United Nations, and it was no longer a completely pliable instrument of U.S. policy, it has fallen out of favor, and the U.S. has been essentially trying to dismantle or marginalize it. That began in the 1960s. You can see that in many ways. For example, Security Council vetoes. The United States is far in the lead, Britain second, France a distant third, contrary to standard propaganda. And it's on a whole range of issues, not just the Middle East, all sorts of other issues. Same is true of General Assembly votes. Agencies of the UN that have a kind of a third world orientation, like UNESCO and UNCTAD, have been kind of either marginalized or in some cases destroyed, organization defunded, and so on. So the vetoing of the rescinding of Resolution 194 fits in a more general pattern. At the same session of the UN, the United States called for restricting or terminating UN activity, these are quotes, with regard to Israel and Palestine, and eliminating all earlier UN resolutions as terms that were used, obsolete and anachronistic. That included all calls for Palestinian rights or all opposition to settlement in the territories. The U.S. position was, quoting, "It is unproductive to debate the legality of these issues." And indeed it was unproductive because from the U.S. point of view the issues had been settled. The United States was now proceeding to impose a settlement that it had been committed to in almost total international isolation for over 20 years, but it was now being instituted. Rescinding Resolution 194 meant also rescinding Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The 194 was passed the day after the Universal Declaration was unanimously passed, and it was essentially a spelling out of Article 13, actually of one half of Article 13. The other half of Article 13 is the best known UN resolution, is the best known part of the Universal Declaration. That's the part of resolution of Article 13 that says everyone has a right to leave his own country. As long as the Cold War was on, every year in Boston and other places there would be passionate denunciations of the Soviet Union for refusing to let our people go, and their violation of Article 13 of the Universal Declaration, led by distinguished Harvard University law professors and so on and so forth. I never once in all of those years ever saw a reference to the last few words of the same sentence. Everyone has a right to leave their own country or to return to their own country. Never once did I see those words mentioned, and it's those words that were spelled out the next day in Resolution 194. By now, the first half of the resolution is irrelevant. You don't need it as a Cold War weapon anymore, and the second part is rescinded, so Article 13 is gone, and with it we have an end to hypocrisy, which, as I say, is a good thing. The second main issue that arose at Oslo was the question of Palestinian rights, and they too were ignored. It's crucial to recall, and this is a big U.S. victory, that the Declaration of Principles, in its reference to the permanent settlement, what happens down the road, referred only to UN 242, not to the other UN resolutions which call for Palestinian national rights alongside of Israel. 242, of course, is completely rejectionist, says nothing about Palestinian rights. In fact, the word Palestinians isn't mentioned. There's a phrase about the just rights of refugees, but that's in passing. So UN 242 is a totally rejectionist resolution, nothing about Palestinians, and the fact that the permanent settlement is based on it is an important victory for the United States, established again in September '93. A third issue that arose is the right of resistance. Now, the international community has unanimously, except for the United States and Israel, agreed, and this is unanimous in this case, that people have the right of resistance to racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. That issue did arise again, it wasn't in the Declaration of Principles, but a side part, Arafat was compelled to sign yet another statement, I don't know how many there have been, but this was another one, renouncing terrorism, but also pledging to suppress any resistance. So now the new Palestinian Authority is to become an agency of the United States and Israel in suppressing the right of resistance, which is accepted, at least formally, it's only formal, by the unanimously by the rest of the world, in this case without exception. That was then, it's been the subsequent agreements have sharpened that, the Y Accords particularly, and so on. This abrogation of the right of resistance is not, again, it's like the UN, it's not a specific Israel-Palestine issue. It also applies elsewhere. I mean, obviously in Lebanon, where the Lebanese do not have the right of resistance to U.S.-backed Israeli attacks, but also in other countries. So, for example, right at this moment, the Turkish army is carrying out another major sweep in southeastern Turkey and regions which have been virtually devastated in the some of the worst ethnic cleansing and operations and massive atrocities of the 1990s, with enormous U.S. support. They're also invading northern Iraq again, and this is to kill Kurds. And Kurds do not have the right of resistance to repression, vicious repression in this case, supported by the Clinton administration, because they're standing in the way of U.S. policies. And it extends more generally. So Nicaraguans didn't have the right of resistance to attack and so on, nor the right to defend their country, in fact. So this is general, but it was in particular in this case. The fourth issue that arose after refugees, Palestinian rights, and right of resistance all eliminated, the fourth issue that arose in the Declaration of Principles was the question of territorial settlement. Well, here the permanent settlement is supposed to be on the basis of UN 242, but it's important to bear in mind, as I'm sure you all know, that there are two versions of UN 242. There's the version that was the initial, that was actually approved and signed and in fact initiated by the United States and was the U.S. position, and that meant withdrawal to the pre-June 67 borders with minor and mutual territorial adjustments. So if some line was curved, you could straighten it out. That was the world position and the U.S. position, the interpretation of 242, until February 1971, when President Sadat of Egypt accepted the U.S. version, in fact, even more forthcoming version, leaving the United States in an odd position. It could either join Israel in rejecting 242, or it could maintain its own position but support Egypt against Israel. And there was an internal bureaucratic battle, which was won by Henry Kissinger. It's one of his contributions to world peace. I think that's probably one of the reasons why he's now the honorary guest of the International Chaplains Association at their humanitarian awards dinner, which is taking place right about now. But Kissinger won that internal struggle, and since then, since 1971, the U.S. policy has been that UN 242 does not call for Israeli withdrawal. It calls for withdrawal as determined by the United States and Israel, so whatever that would be. And what it is some version of the Israeli Alone Plan of 1968, which changes a little bit over the years, but is fundamentally the same. Effectively, Israel will maintain control over the usable territories and the resources of the West Bank and Gaza, but it won't, it doesn't want to administer downtown Nablus or downtown Gaza City, which would be ridiculous. And these should be assigned to the Palestinian Authority to rule in the manner of other colonialist regimes. So in the manner in which Indians ran India under the British Empire, and Central American armies run Central America in the interest of the United States, or the black leadership of Transkei ran it in the interests of South Africa, and so on. These are traditional patterns, and that was to be that's the territorial settlement. Again, a major victory for U.S. rejectionism. In fact, if you look over the whole thing, it's a total victory on every point. And this has been international isolation. It's worth remembering that. The U.S. unilateral interpretation of 242 has been unilateral, no notable support outside the United States. And the same is true on other issues. So in a now forgotten but quite important Security Council meeting of January 1976, there was a resolution backed by essentially the entire world, and the PLO seems to have forgotten it, but they publicly supported that resolution. And in fact, according to the Israeli UN ambassador, they actually prepared it. I don't know if that's true. The resolution called for a two-state settlement in accord with UN 242 as it's understood elsewhere in the world. So a settlement on the, incorporated all the wording of 242, but added that there should be a Palestinian state in the areas from which Israel would withdraw. Israel responded to the calling of the UN session by bombing Lebanon, killing about 50 people, kind of strike against the UN, supported by the United States, so therefore legitimate. The U.S. reacted to the UN session by vetoing the resolution, and so later. And from that point on, the U.S. has been doubly isolated. One, in rejecting UN 242 as understood by itself and the rest of the world, and two, in rejecting Palestinian national rights. Well, General Assembly has, you don't have a technical veto, but remember it is a veto if there's a vote of 150 to 1, and the 1 happens to be the United States. And that happens maybe 150 to 2 or 3 or something like that. And that happens consistently on a whole range of issues. Again, it has nothing specific to do with the Middle East, but that amounts to a veto of the resolution, and usually it's vetoing from history, so they become forgotten. And the General Assembly did vote on this year after year, votes like 150 to 2 roughly. The last vote was December 1990, 144 to 2 that time, calling for essentially the same resolution. That particular date is important. Right after December 1990 came the Gulf War. In the Gulf War, the United States made it extremely clear to the world that the U.S. is going to run this region by force. And if anybody doesn't like it, get out of the way. I mean, whatever else one thinks about the Gulf War, that was the message. In fact, it was declared by George Bush very neatly when he announced the New World Order in 4 words. He said, the New World Order means what we say goes. And if you don't like it, get out of the way. Well, that was understood, and that's the last UN resolution. Then comes the Madrid meetings a couple of months later, in which the U.S. instituted its unilateral rejectionist settlement. We go on to Oslo, and on to the implementation of the Oslo agreements, which sort of spells it out. There shouldn't be anything particularly surprising about this. I mean, anyone who pays attention to world affairs and who's been looking at what's been happening could have foretold step by step, and many people did, everything that was going to happen. Yeah, that's the way it works. The world is ruled by force. The primary rule of international law is the rule of force. Now, of course, you appeal to the rule of law, and the way you do it, as the distinguished, respected elder statesman Dean Acheson pointed out 40 years ago, we appeal to the rule of law in order to gild our positions with moral posturing. But it's to be understood that the law does not apply to us. He happened to be addressing the American Society of International Law, and it was quite honest. That, in fact, is the way the world runs, and it's the task of intellectuals to prettify it and present it in some other fashion so that people don't see what's before their eyes. But it should be before their eyes. None of these are laws of nature, of course. They can be changed. But I think it's rather clear, at least it seems to me, that the most important changes will have to take place right here. Unless they take place within the United States, it's not going to matter much what happens elsewhere.
When I was asked to make this conference about the European Union position and the right of return, I thought it would be an easy task. So I went to read all the resolutions of the European Union of the 80s and the 90s. And I found that the European Union certainly has taken a stand on the national right of the Palestinians, on settlement policy, on Jerusalem, even on the creation of a Palestinian state. But any reference to refugees were vague, and the term right of return was never used. I was more or less tempted to renounce to speak about it, when by chance I stumbled on a document adopted in 1971 by the European Community and known as the Schuman document, after the name of Maurice Schuman, who was a French foreign minister at this time under President Georges Pompidou. It should be borne in mind that in those days, in 1970s, the European Community only had 6 members: France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom were preparing to join the organization in 1972. This resolution, taken on the 13th of May 1971 by the foreign minister of the 6 member countries, stated a support to the Security Council Resolution 242 and demanded specifically an Israeli withdrawal to the line occupied on 4th of June 1967 with minor changes, the creation of demilitarized lines on both sides of the border of Israel with the presence of international force not belonging to the fourth great powers, an international status for Jerusalem, and the right of return to their home for Palestinian refugees or the option of being compensated. When I spoke reading this document to some official of the European Union, nobody remembered of this resolution. And it was really very strange. And I asked myself why the European Union, which has during the 70s and the 80s taken position in support to the Palestinians stronger and stronger, including a support to the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, to the idea of the Palestinian state, why they have forgot this proposal. And I think we should understand why. To understand their silence, we must place it in its context. After the end of the Six-Day War, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Fedayeen movement sought to win recognition for the national right of the Palestinian people. The aim was to place the Palestinian problem in its political context and prevent it from being treated as stipulated in Resolution 242 as nothing more than a problem of refugees. At a diplomatic level, the PLO fought to obtain recognition for two principles. The Palestinians are a nation and they are entitled to self-determination, and the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Under the circumstances, it was almost to be expected that the refugee problem should be pushed into the background, at least at this stage. If we look, for instance, to the famous Venice Declaration adopted by 9 members of the European Community in 1980, it reads, "A just solution must finally be found to the Palestinian problem, which is not simply a problem of refugees." During the whole of the 80s, the European position was just that. The Palestinian problem is not mainly a problem of refugees. The declaration went, this Venice Declaration, to state that the Palestinian people must be placed in a position to exercise fully its right to self-determination. The PLO will have to be associated with the negotiations. Although the text mentions the question of Jerusalem and the settlement, it makes no mention of the right of return or even the question of the refugees. In 1987, at the Madrid summit, at this time there were 12 members in the European community, it stated that the 12 came down in favor of upholding justice for all the people of the region, which include recognition of the legitimate right of the Palestinian people, including the right to self-determination, with all that this implies. This was the first implicit reference to the right of the Palestinians to create a state. This support for the Palestinian national rights culminated in the Amsterdam European Council Declaration of 1997, which called on Israel to recognize, I quote, "the right of the Palestinians to exercise self-determination without excluding the option of a state." This was followed by the Berlin Declaration in last year, which reaffirms the Palestinian permanent and unconditional right of self-determination, including the state option. It also stated that this right should not be subject to any veto, and Europe's readiness to consider the recognition of a Palestinian state in due course. So in about 30 years, Europe consequently came a long way toward recognizing the national right of the Palestinian people and its right to an independent state. The perception of the Palestinians underwent a profound change in Europe among the public opinion and among political leadership. From being a simple refugee problem, it became a problem of self-determination. However, we cannot avoid the fact that this was detrimental to the recognition of the principle of right of return. And I suspect that during this period, 70s and 80s, neither the PLO nor any political Arab force pushed the European Union to adopt position on this question of right of return because it didn't seem so important at this moment. At this moment, what was important, and I think for all of us what was important, was the recognition of the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people and the recognition of the right of the Palestinians to a state and to self-determination. With the start of the Madrid process in October 1991 and then the Oslo Accords signed by the PLO and the Israeli government, European action entered in a new phase. On the one hand, events confirmed that in political terms, Europe had been sidelined. It played no significant role in the Madrid negotiation. It was reduced to acting as a funding agency, and in the years that followed the Oslo Accord, became a major source of funds for the Palestinian Authority. We need to understand the reason for Europe's exclusion to be able to assess its chance of playing a part in a future settlement of the refugee problem. First, the European Union, and this is not restricted to the Middle East, its Middle East position, has been slow to develop as a political power. Everyone sees it as an economic giant and a political dwarf. Coordinating the policy of 15 states, now 15, as politically diverse as the United Kingdom and France, Greece and Netherlands, is not an early task, is not an easy task. Although the 1997 Treaty of Amsterdam includes provisions relating to a common foreign and security policy, we are still a long way from a straightforward decision-making process, particularly as several member countries are convinced that Europe should leave the United States in the Middle East plenty of room for maneuver, as they are the only country capable of acting as intermediary. The second reason why Europe is not playing an important role is that the various parties involved in the negotiation, the USA, Israel, but also the Arab states and the Palestinians, do not take Europe seriously. This is easy enough to understand in the case of the American and Israeli, but the Palestinian and the Arab states, who keep saying they want Europe to play an important part, do very little to support its participation in the field. However, Europe's political role acquired new impetus during the last years. In 1996, this led to the appointment of Miguel Angel Moratinos as European Union representative for the Middle East, in addition to several political proposals to provide the various parties with guarantees and a number of original ideas. On the question of the refugee, the European Union took part in the multilateral refugee working group set up by the Madrid conference that started in October 1991. Although there is still little to show for the negotiations which have stopped now, they have forced the European Union to face up to the problem. However, it was above all the end of the interim period in 1999 and the start of the negotiation on the final status that made everyone in Europe realize how important it was to find a solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. At the European Council meeting in Luxembourg in 1997, the European Union expressed its, I quote, readiness to contribute to permanent status negotiations by offering specific suggestions to the parties on related subjects, including possible Palestinian statehood, border security, arrangement, settlement, refugees, Jerusalem, and water issues. In April 1998, and I think it's important, the European Union take a decision to create an informal working group on refugees, setting the following objectives: to identify and develop topics on which information and thinking is inadequate, to foster contacts with and between the parties, to develop elements of reflection that would help the European Union to direct its policy in favor of a solution to the refugee problem. On the 6th of October 1998, the group approved a French proposal to prepare an internal memorandum on the guiding principle for a common European position on the refugees question. The group recommended that the term of this document should not be, quote, too prescriptive, emphasizing that the solution could not be restricted to a bilateral issue and that it had to have a regional and international dimension that justified the attempt to define a common European Union position on the question. However, in the course of the consultation, no reference was apparently made to accept the Resolution 194 as a basis of discussion, even if individually all the European countries are voting every year in the United Nations in favor of this resolution. I want, in conclusion, to say something about the French position, which is one of the few countries to continue to refer explicitly to the right of return. Addressing the Senate Commission on Foreign Affairs on the 24th of November 1999, Hubert Védrine, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, said, "Israel is clearly against the return of the first wave of Palestinian refugees and is moving towards the idea of compensation. As far as France is concerned, the basis in international law regarding this question is to be found in the various United Nations resolutions which affirm the right of return of the refugee. Ultimately, it is up to the interested party to find a solution." In other words, he clearly reaffirmed the refugee right of return. This right was also reaffirmed by him during a visit in Beirut in November 1999. He said to the Beirut radio station, "The Palestinian refugee in the Lebanon must be treated fairly and in keeping with international law. Resolution 194 speaks for the right of return. It is a principle to start from, and we must try to move forward through negotiation and discussion." During his trip also he suggested that in due course, une concertation internationale, meaning an international dialogue, should be initiated on Palestinian refugees. This should be based on the following principle. The problem of refugees and displaced persons is an important issue. It does not only concern Israel and the Palestinian Authority, but also the so-called host parties. This proposal is still vague, but it could, if it was taken up by the various partners, in particular by the Palestinian and Arab countries, gather substance, enabling the refugee problem to be formulated in a more positive fashion. In conclusion, I just want to say that European Union can play an important role in the Middle East. It will depend on many factors, among them, of course, the development of a public opinion in support of the Palestinian people inside the different European countries, but it will also depend on the willingness of the Palestinian and the Arab countries to develop an alliance with the European Union. Thank you very much.
That was part one from the Right of Return conference held at Boston University Law School. Make sure that you tune in next week for the second part of this panel. Last week, we aired part one from panel number one. This week, we continue with part two. The panel was entitled Critical Analysis of Israeli, American, European, and the PLO Positions. Last week, you heard Ilan Pappe, Director, International Relations Division, Haifa University, Noam Chomsky, Department of Linguistics, MIT, Alain Grish, Editor, Le Monde Diplomatique. This week, you will hear from Jaber Suleiman, co-founder of Aidun, and Robert Fisk, the independent newspaper. Let's go to part two of the panel.
The meaning of return in the Palestinian collective consciousness is the very opposite of that of the Nakba, of refuge and of exile. Return alone is supposed to be capable of dispelling the injustice which has afflicted the Palestinians since the Nakba and its repercussions. It's sharply contrasted with the assimilation and resettlement outside the homeland. The symbolic opposition between the notion of return and the reality of refuge has been manifested in the Palestinian political discourse, to the extent that the first Palestinian National Council, which was held in Jerusalem in 1964, resolved to use the term returnee in place of refugee to describe those Palestinians who had been displaced from their homelands. The PLO position on the issue of return has witnessed some decisive developments since the convening of the first Palestinian National Council in Jerusalem. As a result of these developments, the centrality of the concept of return in the contemporary Palestinian struggle has been called into question. These developments have taken place gradually and in stages in such a way that each step has paved the way for each subsequent step. The first stage is from the establishment of the PLO to the provisional political program. The issue of return was never detached from the goal of liberation the entire territory of Palestine until the 12th session of the Palestinian National Council, 1974. At that session, the PNC adopted what was variously known as the Provisional Political Program, or the 10-point program, or the National Authority Program. This program has been considered a turning point in Palestinian political thinking, as we shall show in due course. Up until that point, return was considered the natural outcome of total liberation. This fact was reflected in the main slogan of the PLO at that time, which was national unity, national mobilization, and liberation. It was also reflected in a fundamental manner in the text of the Palestinian National Charter as revised by the armed elements, that is, the armed factions which deposed the PLO chairman Ahmed Shukairi and seized control of the PLO following the defeat of June 1967. That text affirms that Palestine is the homeland of the Palestinian Arab people and that it has the right to its homeland, Palestine, with its mandatory Palestine borders. The revised ninth article of the Charter states that armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine, and it states that the aims of the struggle are the liberation of the homeland, the return to it, and self-determination, and sovereignty over Palestine. The second stage from the provisional political program to the declaration of independence. In conformity with the Arab and international conditions following the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973 and subsequent development, PLO adopted the Provisional Political Program of 1974. This program constitutes a decisive turning point in the Palestinian political thinking with regard to the relationship between the strategic goals of the Palestinian national movement and its interim tactical goals, as well as with regard to the conduct of the conflict with Israel and the Zionist movement. As for the issue of return, the expression right of return makes its first appearance in the preamble of the 10-point program after having been absent from the resolution of previous PNC meetings. This was also the first time that return was discussed separately from total liberation. The program affirmed that the right of return was one of the foremost and primary rights of the Palestinian people, but made no reference to the Resolution 194 nor to any of the other relevant United Nations resolutions. The policy of the PLO mainstream reached its natural conclusion with the convening of the 19th session of the PNC in Algeria 1988 in an atmosphere influenced by the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising which erupted in Palestine in late 1987. The meeting marked the apex of the effort to establish a national authority or independent state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip as a result of a regional settlement of the conflict. To sum up the position of the PLO during this period, we can say that the political discourse of the PLO, including the discourse concerning the right of return, underwent substantial transformation over a period of almost a quarter of a century. The period began with the convening of Jerusalem PNC, which passed the Palestinian National Charter, and ended with the 19th PNC in Algeria, which passed the Declaration of Independence. In between these two sessions, the 12th PNC adopted the Provisional Political Program. In this discourse, the PLO was transformed from the national liberation movement of the Palestinian people, which aimed at the liberation of Palestine, the overthrow of the ideological basis of the State of Israel and the establishment of a democratic state on the whole territory of Palestine to a national independence movement, exerting efforts to secure a stateless or Palestinian entity alongside Israel. In this process, it came to accept United Nations resolution as a basis for the right of return and as a framework for resolving the refugee issue. The third stage, from Madrid to Oslo and beyond, to analyze the PLO position with respect to the right of return as revealed in the contents of the documents, the basic documents, which is the letters of mutual recognition and the declaration of principle, one may come to the conclusion that the declaration of principles and its four annexes, as well as the letters of mutual recognition, are very clear when it comes to Israeli interests, but are ambiguous when it comes to the rights of Palestinian people. Such ambiguities are ultimately favorable to the stronger party, since the stronger party can force an interpretation of the documents which serves its interests. These documents have given Israel certain prerogatives which conflict with the international legality, since according to the international law, Israel is still considered as occupation force. These documents have also preempted the Palestinian people's rights of return, self-determination, and sovereignty. In sum, these documents have deprived the Palestinian struggle of its international legitimacy and have revoked the legal sources of authority for Palestinian rights. These have done so by making the negotiations the reference point for the Palestinian rights rather than vice versa. The last point, the PLO position on the right of return as expressed in practice since Oslo has tampered with the legal framework of Palestinian rights as found in international law and the resolutions of the United Nations. It has also contravened the National Charter, which affirms the unity of the Palestinian people and the unity of its historic national aspiration regarding its ancestral homeland. Some Israeli and U.S. positions may serve to convey the grave damage that has been done to the Palestinian national struggle. Former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres has described the amendment of the Palestinian National Charter as the most important ideological shift during the current century. Similarly, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stated in September 1994 that United Nations resolutions concerning the question of Palestine were contentious and time-worn. The consequences of the negotiations on the Palestinian track and the expectations from negotiations on other Arab tracks all point towards bypassing the right of return and prolonging Palestinian displacement. They also lead to the undermining of the right of self-determination by the certain of a mere Palestinian entity which resembles a Bantustan more than it does fully sovereign independent state. It's one of the ironies of history that the racist regime in South Africa, which has been dismantled at a time when Israel continues to impose a resolution of the question of Palestine which consolidates a kind of racist apartheid in Palestine with the full backing of the United States. Moreover, this is taking place at the start of the 21st century, which is supposed to be the century of democracy and human rights. Some Palestinian scholars have compared the nascent Palestinian autonomy to Transkei in South Africa, the autonomous region set up by the racist South African regime for blacks in 1963, which was declared an independent state despite the fact that it only gained recognition from the apartheid regime itself. Other Palestinian scholars have noted that the reality which Israel is currently putting into effect on the land of Palestine is drawn from three sources: The first is the apartheid system imposed by white South Africans on blacks. The second is a system of reservations which was imposed by the United States and Canada on the indigenous inhabitants of North America. And the third is a system of segregation which was adopted in the States up to the early 60s to isolate American blacks from whites in their places of residence, work, public services, and so on. In so doing, Israel takes its reliance from the notion of racial or ethnic purity found in Zionist ideology and implements this in confiscating and annexing Palestinian land with the smallest proportion possible of Palestinian inhabitants, according to a statement once made by former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. After the signing of the final status accord, the Palestinian people will probably find itself split between insiders and outsiders, with half the population living in exile, in isolation from the other half which will live in the projected Palestinian entity, deprived of its legitimate rights to return and self-determination in its homeland. In order to avoid such a black fate, the Palestinian people everywhere must reiterate their insistence on the unity of the land and the people. In particular, the Palestinians of the diaspora must form a historic coalition to express a resolute position on the right of return and self-determination, and to reject resettlement or restitution instead of return. May return remain a legitimate dream which will be implemented in practice. In this context, let's remember Gramsci's motto about the pessimism of intelligence and the optimism of will. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, my watch loses 4 minutes in every 20 minutes. Just over a week ago, aware that I was going to be addressing you today, I took a familiar walk through the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp in Beirut. With me was a friend who had never visited the camp before but knew its sinister, tragic history. I showed her the mass grave site where more than 500 of the Palestinian civilians massacred by Israel's Phalangist allies were buried in 1982. Today, it is a rubbish dump. There is no memorial to the dead. Up to 2,000 disappeared during the slaughter of September 16th, 18th, 1982. Garbage, at this moment, lies strewn behind the wall of the graveyard, and a solitary goalpost where Lebanese Shiite Muslim children play football above the dead. As we walked out of the camp, I asked my companion what she was thinking. If I lived here, she said, I would go mad. And I remembered that I had given the same reply when asked the same question by an American magazine executive 6 years ago. And I had recalled for him then that one of the Palestinians accused of an attack on El Al passengers at Vienna airport in the 80s had told police, I am from Sabra and Shatila. But of course, we journalists are cynical folk. I used to ask the Palestinians I knew in Sabra Shatila if they thought they would return to Palestine. A few knew there was a UN resolution. They didn't know the crucial difference between a General Assembly and a Security Council resolution, and the number 194 would have left most of them mystified. But yes, they would insist they would return to Galilee, to Haifa and Acre. Most, of course, of the Galilee people came to Lebanon. As the years passed, and I asked the same question of the same survivors of the massacre, their conviction began to falter. God willing is not the same as yes. And once they had understood the true meaning of the Oslo Accord, a few souls would simply shrug their shoulders at my question. Most years, I write an article on the anniversary of the 1982 massacre. Usually I preface my report with the claim that the London Independent, my own newspaper, will be the only one recording the anniversary. And I am always right in saying that. And I always ask, if the position were reversed, whether this awful date would be remembered. Please God, no comparable tragedy is ever repeated. But had the victims been Israelis, I often ask myself, and no sane or decent person would wish this, but had the victims been Israelis and the perpetrators not Israel's allies but Palestinians, would the cemetery be a garbage tip? Would America's journalists, now warned by the US ambassador in Lebanon, by the way, of the dangers of, yes, terrorism in the refugee camps, would these American reporters so regularly and so uniquely ignore the anniversary of Sabra and Shatila? I do not think so. There would be photographs, there would be long interviews with survivors each year. American presidents would arrive to stand before such a place of infamy in order to remember the innocent dead. But of course, Sabra Shatila is in Lebanon, and its survivors are disenfranchised non-people waiting to return to homes over whose ruins the world has constructed a new nation. The victims of the Beirut massacre were killed by the wrong murderers, allied to the wrong side in the Arab-Israeli tragedy. What happened here has been erased by the media as surely as the villages from which the victims came. Officially, and I'm using UNRWA figures, there are now perhaps 400,000 Palestinians in Lebanon, but I suspect the real statistic is far lower. The Democratic Front, for example, calculates that only perhaps 175,000 Palestinians remain in all of Lebanon, that 250,000 have departed for Northern Europe, Denmark, Germany and Sweden in particular, and that up to 85,000 have received Lebanese passports. More than half of Sabra Shatila, for example, is now occupied by Lebanese and Syrian families. Evictions, restriction on all but the most menial labor for Palestinians, Lebanese legislation which demanded re-entry visas even from those Palestinians with residence cards, the PLO's end to financial aid to schools and health centers. All have helped to achieve what the Israelis sought in 1982, the further dispersal of those who once believed they had the right to return. It's my contention that the attempts to achieve peace in the Middle East have involved semantics, language, and the use of language rather than straightforward mendacity to obscure and change the rights and future of all the people who live there. The Balfour Declaration, for example, refers to a Jewish homeland in Palestine, not just that part of Palestine which has become Israel. UN Security Council Resolution 242's failure to use the word all before the word territories, from which the Israelis were supposed to withdraw, allowed Israel to claim that only some of the occupied lands have to be returned. I don't recall, of course, Resolution 242 actually saying some of the territories. Read the American press now, and you'll find that Israel is in any case no longer being urged to return lands, but to hand them over or give them up, as if those territories occupied in '67 were actually part of Israel, as Golan under Israeli law is. Look at the very generic title of America's peace effort in the Middle East. It's not a peace. It's very definitely not a peace plan, which is what it was called in the days of Carter and Vance. It's now a peace process. I love that word. Note the word, process. We all use it. You used it today. Most of the speakers talked about the peace process without the slightest thought. But what on earth does process mean? That peace continues, which it clearly does not for the residents of Sabra Shatila and the other refugee camps in Lebanon. Does process mean that peace is unstoppable, like something you pull off a supermarket shelf? The word process indicates movement and speed. A carriage or train moving towards conclusion, which from time to time, and thanks to the obtuseness of the folk who've been forced to board this rickety transportation system, has to be put, yes, back on track. Who invented, I ask you, this phrase, and who persuaded every one of you to use it? It's a peace built on cliches and ambiguities. Take the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, we used to call it. And though my colleagues in the press have found the Israeli nomenclature of Judea and Samaria a little bit too much to accept, the occupied territories have now become, in many reports, the territories, an unadorned word used by the Israelis themselves, of course. And instead of being called occupied, they have become, thanks to the US State Department's own briefings, disputed territories, like a dispute you might have with your neighbor about a row of trees, the height of your sitting room, the alignment of a boundary fence. And thus, too, legitimacy is buried in semantics. Now, if the Madrid Peace Conference was held on the basis that a Middle East peace was founded on UN Security Council Resolution 242, as then Secretary of State James Baker insisted in his invitations to those all too willing Arab leaders, the Oslo Agreement has undermined 242. Because it gave the Israelis the right to renegotiate 242. They could say, this bit can go back to you, this bit can't. And just the same way as 242 itself reduced the demand of General Assembly Resolution 194 on the right of return to a just settlement of the problem of the refugees, which is not a right to return at all. Now Oslo has produced a similar verbal diminution, which I think you've not spotted. Whereas before Oslo, Palestinians might claim that their demand for a return possessed international legitimacy, albeit in the General Assembly rather than the Security Council, Arafat's acceptance of Israeli authority over part of the land that was Palestine has legally reduced the supposed legitimacy of a right to return to a request. Return for the refugees of Sabra and Shatila is no longer a legitimate, inalienable right for Palestinians. It has become merely a Palestinian demand, part of the Arab-Israeli dispute, a pleading rather than an unquestioned principle, a humble request to Israel and the United States, rather than part of a just peace. No wonder it has ended up in the final status basket. The word final, in my journalistic experience, is almost always synonymous with finished. When I was invited to speak to you today, I was appalled to see that the subject of my talk was supposed to be, and I quote, Arab regional positions on the Palestinian refugee right of return. I was astonished by such an idea. Arab regional positions implied some kind of cut and thrust debate over Palestinian rights in Arab countries. And in a state of mild amusement, I did actually telephone some of my journalistic colleagues in Cairo and the Gulf a few days ago. A position on the right of return, my Egyptian friend asked with laughter. Well, of course, we're for it. But he said, I can't remember it ever being debated. In the Emirates, my colleague was even blunter. We accepted this like we accepted the PLO as the only legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, he said. Now the PLO has made peace. And he laughed again, and that was that. It's a supreme irony, I think, that the only Arab nation where the Palestinian right of return is still debated is Lebanon, the land in which the Palestinians have endured their greatest suffering, their greatest victories, and their greatest defeats. Here their rights, so often ignored or so often flaunted by the PLO when they offered little respect for Lebanon, their host state, they have now become sacrosanct in official statements. Not because the Lebanese want the Palestinians to go home to Palestine, but because they want the Palestinians to get out of Lebanon. The right of return has been transformed into the right to leave. There can be no peace, Lebanese Prime Minister Salim al-Hass tells us, until there is a solution to the Palestinian problem. The Palestinians cannot stay in Lebanon. Hass actually raised this issue with Madeleine Albright during her latest visit to Beirut. The US Secretary of State, I'm told, responded with her concerns about international terrorism. And so the Palestinians of Lebanon find themselves in a very odd situation. Those who would most like their absence are those who most fervently support their right of return. Their antagonists are now their allies because of their antagonism. President Lahoud of Lebanon asked UN Secretary General Kofi Annan 4 days ago whether the UN wished to disarm the Palestinian refugee camps prior to an Israeli withdrawal from 10% of Lebanon this summer. Could the UN prevent Palestinian guerrilla attacks against Israel if Israel leaves Lebanon without a peace with Beirut and Damascus? Lahoud asked. In other words, the Palestinians of Lebanon are now again a card. And this summer, as a war looks ever more likely in southern Lebanon, the Palestinians are expected to perform their role once more. Denuded of rights, stripped of their right of return, transformed into a wish to return by the Oslo Agreement, the Palestinians of Lebanon are to be resurrected one final time to frustrate Israeli plans for Lebanon and Syria. True, the identity of Palestinians in Lebanon remains intact, but it's no longer tied to the idea of return. One of Arafat's PLO officials in Rashidiyah camp, since condemned to death in absentia by the Lebanese government, told me a few years ago that even a few symbolic returns of 1948 Palestinian families to present-day Israel might be sufficient to settle the right to return issue. We had to be realistic, he said. The villages were no longer there. Things had changed. There were facts on the ground, which is exactly what the Americans now say, and it's exactly what the Israelis now say. When the PLO cut off funding to healthcare and schools in the Lebanese camps, it was acknowledging these facts. Do you? I'm always fascinated, and you're not going to like the next bit of what I have to say, I'm always fascinated by the Arab-American concern for the Arabs, and particularly the Palestinians of the Middle East. With a few honorable exceptions, it's not a very brave lobby, the Arab-American lobby. And I wonder how closely it really is in touch with the reality in the Middle East, how much it understands the nature of hopes diminished and destroyed in the ash heaps of Sabra and Shatila. And when I see the desperation this has produced, when I hear the new, harsher voices of Einal Helwi, the voices of those who can have a new use this summer, I ask myself whether conferences such as this really achieve what they're intended to achieve. I enjoyed your drinks at the Harvard Faculty Club last night, the fine carpets and the oil paintings and the attentive waiters, but I wondered about its connection with Sabra and Shatila. I wonder if you wondered. And I asked myself whether, like the people of Sabra and Shatila, though in somewhat different circumstances looking through you, you might somehow have got used to your new life in exile. A young Palestinian man told me last night that he'd never been to Palestine because he had young children, and traveling with children is not pleasant. And he compared such a proposed journey to his recent family visit to Disney World. Can you imagine, he asked me, traveling to Palestine with children? And I wondered, I truly wondered about your right of return. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, we have some time for questions and answers. So if you can raise your hand, there's a revolving mic. We have some 15 to 20 minutes to take questions. Oh, okay. Okay, we'll start right there.
Thank you very much. My name is Fouad Sahyoun. I'm from Haifa myself. I have a question to Dr. Pappe and a question to Dr. Chomsky. Dr. Pappe, first of all, I really appreciate coming from Haifa as well, your statements on the right of return and your support. My question was, I was in Haifa last month and discussing with a lot of people, whether Jews or Arabs. In fact, probably the town that's mostly tolerant in its relationship between Arabs and Jews. I met with some leftist Jews who said, from the left to the right, we all do not stand for the right of return, but compensation, yes. Basically, my question is, what would be the position of the leftist Jews or the liberal Jews should there be a massive return of Palestinians in the national entity of a Jewish state as an emblem? My second question is Dr. Chomsky. What happened to the position of the U.S. since Mr. Bush, as President Bush, when he convened the first committee in Ottawa for the refugee groups, said that this committee is going to be meeting under the heading of the 194 resolution. And Israel walked out of that meeting, which was the first meeting of that committee in in Ottawa. What happened to the position of the U.S. since that strong support to today's rejection at the General Assembly? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't know. Does this work? Can you hear? I'm glad you found people of the Israeli left. I'm still looking for them. I think that you have to distinguish in Israel between Zionist and anti-Zionist or non-Zionist positions in what is called the Israeli left. And the figures for that distinction are the figures for positions on the right of return. In other words, I would say, judging by surveys which were conducted in the last 2 years about Israeli attitudes towards the right of return, that the large majority of the Jewish population in Israel is categorically opposed to the right of return. However, there is an increase in the number of people who are willing to recognize the Israeli responsibility and to seek a solution based on that recognition. So in macro historical terms, it is still a very small group of Israelis who are willing to consider such a solution and a full implementation of the right of return or any implementation of the right of return. But this small group is growing in numbers with every passing year, and I think its importance should not be diminished, and one should not give up the public scene in Israel as part of the battle for the implementation of the right of return. Thank you.
Well, beginning with the strong support of President Bush for the right of return, that was pure and total hypocrisy. And if it had not been, it was not strong support, it was nonsense. And if it had not been pure and total hypocrisy, Israel would not have walked out with complete impunity. Israel's not a free agent. They can operate within bounds set by the United States. Doesn't decide everything, but it sets the bounds pretty firmly. So if Israel walked out, that's like Israel bombing Lebanon in January 1976. That's with U.S. authorization, and so on for the rest, including Sabra and Shatila. What happens, and in fact it wasn't even reported because it's recognized by U.S. journalists that it's meaningless. These are meaningless words. What happened since is just what I talked about. In the immediate wake of the Washington meeting on the Declaration of Principles, there was a UN session in December 1993, and at the session the United States officially rescinded 194. There was a vote, as there usually is every year, and it was 127 to 2 this time instead of to 1, because the United States joined with Israel in rejecting Resolution 194, and also, as I mentioned, I won't repeat, calling for the abandonment of all UN resolutions concerned with Israel and Palestine as obsolete and anachronistic, and eliminating any discussion of settlements because the legal issues are a waste of time now. So that's what happened since Bush's statement, resolving hypocrisy. So as I say, I regard it as a welcome move. As for the present position, well, you take a look at this morning's Boston Globe, where there's an article by an op-ed, probably designed for this conference, by the Israeli novelist A.B. Yehoshua, who explains carefully that we're all misunderstanding what's going on. There aren't any refugees. There are only displaced people. He's on the left, incidentally, who I'm a supporter of merits, I suppose, probably, isn't he? Yeah. There aren't any refugees. There are only displaced people. They moved a little distance within their own homeland, and for Arabs, it's all one homeland. So there really aren't any refugees, and there's nothing to talk about. And that's the evolving position. And it will be the position because it's responsive to what U.S. power interests determine to be in their interests. And it has nothing particular to do with Arabs or Palestinians. So, for example, as I said, a little bit to the north, Turkey is once again continuing its huge massacres against Kurds, and that's legitimate too. It's done with a huge flow of U.S. arms escalating as the atrocities increase, and they don't have any rights either. The support for Turkey is very similar to the support for Israel. They play roughly a comparable role in the U.S. system for dominating the Middle East oil regions, and that's what determines rights. So that's what happened to the U.S. position. It went from hypocrisy to honesty.
Hi. Hello. My name is Michel Abdelnour. I'm a Palestinian. Question regarding Palestinian properties prior 1948. A lot of people are constantly asking me, and I don't know what to answer. If our representatives, whatever you call them, sign off some kind of a deal in the UN against most Palestinians' will about the Palestinian properties prior to 1948, could that decision ever be appealed? I don't know if I can ask Mr. Chomsky to answer, or whoever would like to answer. Second, about the settlements. Settlements are still going more than ever before, especially with the new government. I think the longer we wait, the more lands are being confiscated. So what could be the solution for the settlements, if any?
Well, can the issue be appealed? Sure, it can be appealed. I mean, for example, there happens to be, just to pick one of the minor footnotes in the history of Clintonite terrorism, it's so small that it's kind of worth talking about. There happens to be a poor African country which Clinton decided to bomb and destroyed half of its pharmaceutical and fertilizer supplies, killing unknown, surely tens of thousands of people. Now, they could appeal. In fact, they made a request to the UN to carry out an inquiry. Okay, that was vetoed. It's also been vetoed from history. So, yeah, you can appeal. And you can give a long list of other possibilities of appeal. So, for example, to take another UN vote, which was not reported here, a couple of months ago, the UN voted unanimously. I think there were half a dozen abstentions, with 2 in opposition, once again, against the U.S. embargo against Cuba, which has been declared illegal by every available authority. So they can appeal, yeah, Cubans can appeal. But if the world just isn't run that way, the world is run by the powerful who use force. So the appeals don't mean anything. Dean Acheson, in the words I quoted, was exactly accurate. International law does not apply to the United States. That's been made clear and explicit over and over again, though we can use it to gild our positions. With regard to the settlements, there could be an appeal, but only if there's overwhelming public support for it, which compels the powerful to yield, which happens. It does happen on a lot of issues. But other than that, the formal right of appeal doesn't mean anything. As for the settlements, yeah, they're expanding under the present government as before. In fact, some of the most, there was some of the most provocative of them, like what Israel calls Har Hamas, or the final surrounding of Jerusalem, which was initiated by the Paris government, incidentally, and was in abeyance under Netanyahu, is now going full force again, with lots of houses going up and so on for Jews. And how can they do it? Well, somebody pays for it, namely U.S. taxpayers. So as long as U.S. taxpayers pay for it, they can continue to do it. And as long as there's no opposition here, and for the moment there's no significantly organized opposition, though the population happens to be overwhelmingly opposed to it if you look at polls, but there's no organized opposition, that's another failure of, I agree with Bob Fisk on this, it's a failure of people who could have organized opposition, that then it doesn't matter. The U.S. will continue to pay for it because the U.S. approves of it, and the settlements will continue. They can be withdrawn completely, but that will take a U.S. decision.
Can I just make one comment? I admire your faith in justice and UN documents and so on. The names Srebrenica and Kana flit basically, very faintly through the back of my mind. I don't think it's got anything to do with claims and putting things before courts. I have a game I play in Beirut on my little computer, and I hate emails and computers anyway, but I get all the documents from the State Department about Middle East policy of the United States, and then I get all the documents put out by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and I shuffle them all up. And they're absolutely identical. And there is no point in thinking that you can go to courts, international courts in The Hague, the United Nations in Geneva, the UN on the East River, etc. It'll be absolutely no use. The only way ultimately you're going to be able to make any change, if you want to, in the Middle East, is by influencing ordinary Americans. And I notice, as usual, if you want to, this is for you to decide, but I notice that as usual, and I do a lot of lectures in America, far too many, because I think most of them are useless, that as usual, perhaps less than 10% of the audience are non-Arab Americans. I gave a lecture at Harvard 2 years ago. I said, what am I doing here? 98% Lebanese. I can walk next to my apartment in Beirut and talk to AUB. Seriously. I mean, don't some of you have friends who are not of Arab extraction? Can't you bring them along? If you care, it's not for me to say. I'm just amazed that at all these meetings, the one group of people who could have some influence on your concerns, who would be Americans who are not part of your community, are generally not here. There are a few I know, but they're not here. Why not? That's the answer to your question.
What? The suggestion is exactly what he said, and in fact exactly what I said. You have to work with people here. I mean, for example, about over the last 30 years, roughly 2/3 or 3/4 of the U.S. population has been in favor of a Palestinian state. Okay? But they have no influence and no effect because they don't care that much, and they're not going to get organized about it. And unless serious efforts are made here to carry out education and organization, nothing will happen. I mean, I don't know if this is the place to go into it, but I have spent 30 years trying to do this, and one of the worst enemies has been the PLO, literally. I mean, if you want, I can give you details of efforts to try to get the PLO to use some of the huge funds they had, way too much for their own good, in my opinion, because they had a corrupting influence, just to do trivial things, like, say, since books can't be reviewed or mentioned, just buy books and send them to libraries. No, not unless it says on it, given with the as a gift of the PLO. Well, you know what that's going to mean. And I can go on, including personal meetings. It's been extremely hard. There's no difficulty. I mean, obviously I'm here, so I talk to Americans all the time. It's not hard to give talks to non-Arab audiences on this issue. I do it all the time. They're huge audiences. They're interested and they're concerned, but there isn't much follow-up. In fact, I've had to do with a lot of third world movements over the years, and the Palestinians are about the only one where the national that I can think of, where the national leadership, didn't really make any effort to try to organize public support in the United States, which is the only thing that's going to matter. They have not tried, and I think that the reason, I mean, you know it better than I do, so if I'm wrong, tell me, but I think the reason is that the leadership simply has never had any conception of the way a democratic society functions. For them, politics means deals in back rooms with other rich people, The fact that you're going to have organized public pressure to get anything to happen, whether it's restricting U.S. violence in Indochina or in Central America or anything else, that never registered. And the efforts of many people, including many of you, to stimulate support and organization just had extremely limited effect, partly for that reason.
Yeah, I'm Mazum Kumsiya from Yale University in New Haven. I'm in the clinical field, so obviously one of my questions, or the question I have, relates to the fact that what we are observing is obviously a lot of diagnosis and not very much in way of treatment of how do we go from here. And I don't want to preempt the last session. Maybe the last session is what it's going to talk about, looking into the future and what we can do. And I just want to ask you again, and Robert Fisk maybe addressed part of this, is what we can do. So if any of you can tell us concretely what we can do. There are 600 people here, and each one of us, like you said, maybe knows 20 people. So if you can tell us concretely what we can achieve as individuals. Just anybody, if you can give us some ideas.
I don't know who's it addressed to, but if it's, I mean, what you can do is exactly what people did who organized the Central America Solidarity movements, wherever they lived, maybe in a church in Kansas. What you can do is go back to your own communities, wherever you're from, and begin the hard, long process of education and organization. It's work. You know, you don't go like that. I mean, in the case of the Vietnam War, for example, which became a big issue, I mean, it was approximately 6 years of hard work before you could get a meeting 1/10 this size, and I'm not joking. It took 6 years in Boston before you could have a public, that's after the U.S. started bombing Vietnam. It took 6 years before in Boston it was possible to have a public meeting that wasn't broken up by attackers with the support of the media. You know, it takes work, and it can be done. It's been done on many cases, and it's achieved results, but it won't happen if you just, you know, come around once in a while and talk about it.
Can I just add one thing there? I've found in the last 6 or 7 years lecturing in the States that by and large Arab American lobbies are very lazy. I'll give you a classic example. I was at a different lecture at Harvard, and it was arranged by Lebanese students, very nice. Guy stands up in the audience, I'm sick of the mainstream press, it's rubbish, for which I was very grateful, of course. And then he said, they didn't pay any attention to this meeting. So I said, what did you do to advertise it? He said, we sent the Boston Globe an email. And that was enough. Look, whether you want a lobby group that's powerful or not, and whether you have a case to put or not, is not my problem. I'm a journalist. But I'm amazed that more of you don't write letters to the editor. I know it's boring. I know many of them aren't printed, but they're read. They matter at the end of the day. I remember, you know, in '82, during the siege of Beirut, I was there then. I was working as Middle East correspondent for the London Times before Mr. Murdoch ate it, and I moved to the Independent. But on the Times at the time, I wrote a long series of articles which told the truth of everything from the mass bombardment of civilian areas by air attack, tank fire, which kind of artillery, the use of phosphorus shells in civilian areas, cluster bombs around Uzai, and then the full story of Sabra and Shatila, because I was in the camps when the Phalange was still there. And I was bitterly criticized in our letters columns by Israeli diplomats and by readers who supported Israel, and they had every right to write letters, and we had every right to print them, which we did correctly in my view. And during that entire period, not a single letter came from a single person of Arab origin or a single sympathizer of the Arabs to suggest that, well, maybe the Times correspondent had a point in reporting all this. I don't think it was cowardice particularly. I think it was just a kind of laziness. I've lost count of the number of times I've come to give lectures in the States and traveled about 12,000 miles and not been met at the airport, not been told where I'm supposed to go. I tell you, whenever I've dealt with groups which are of Jewish origin, they don't make that mistake. They're very assiduous, they work hard, they're very polite, they make sure everything works. I don't think I think I'll give you a final story, and it's a sad one. It involves a friend of mine in Beirut whose nephew had come from Florida, where he was running a supermarket chain. If you know him, you know the Lebanese, you know the religion and everything. Anyway, it was Ahway, so we had many, many coffins, and he was telling me about how he'd gone from Lebanon at the beginning of the war. He'd built up this great supermarket chain. Things were great. He was making money. He was going to be a millionaire, etc. And he said, and when the 1991 Gulf War started, Mr. Robert, all the television networks came to see me. So I said, what did you say? And he said, well, I couldn't say very much. I was running a supermarket chain. I have business. And I said to myself, so what am I doing driving around southern Lebanon? What am I doing? I mean, I think that you individually, not just the few people who are interested in bringing up meetings, have to ask yourselves, if you're interested in this, and it's up to you, not me, it's not my problem, whether you actually do enough, whether perhaps, you know, why not meet journalists and try to talk to them and have coffee with them and go to newspaper offices and explain what you think. I don't think just sitting around complaining about bias, which is what I do all the time, is actually good enough. I think you've really got to work, and I don't think most people in Arab American lobbies want to work, frankly.
I want to put in something there.
No, the problem is that throughout this morning, everyone has been encouraging and positive, but no one has been critical, and that is the problem.
You want to ask your question, please?
I'm Layla Hijab. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm Layla Hijab. I live in Cambridge, and I'm from the West Bank. In response to one thing you said, I think one problem the Arab Americans are having, and I felt it as a mother, as an educator, there's a lot of attack on us, on Islam, on Arabs. So a lot of people tend to protect their children by telling them, don't speak Arabic outside, don't talk about that. So that's one issue. I think we have to go to education, we have to educate the public, we have to work in schools, we have to really talk to people who make a difference. Teachers are very ignorant in the United States about the Middle East, about Palestine, about Islam. That's a very crucial point. As parents, we need to be active in our children's schools. My last child is not going to public school. I gave up. I spent 20 years battling public schools. Now my last one's going to a private school that debates anything and everything. Maybe she doesn't get everything she needs to get, but she's getting that point. We have to really be active. As an educator, I try to push in schools. The wall is very thick. As a matter of fact, I'm told if I bring any issues of politics, the door's open to the outside. Of course, that doesn't stop me, but it causes a lot of friction in my job. The other thing I'd like to talk about is, as a daughter of a person who was a lawyer and a judge for 30 years of his life, I think as Palestinians, as Arab Americans, as Arabs who support them, as Americans who support them, we need to go to the international courts. Eventually, that's going to be our path. Maybe not in our lifetime, but maybe in our children's time. We need to think in the long-term process that we need to sue the Israeli government for the restitution. Thank you.
Okay,
just a brief comment on that. I mean, I think it makes sense to go to the international courts, but without illusions.